This is Brian with the Left Field Gardener, and we've got a treat for you. A couple days ago, we had a Gardening 101 class here, and my buddy Russell taught it. Russell is not only an enthusiastic community gardener, but he has a degree in ag business. He also runs several commercial greenhouses right now, and he's taught a number of college-level courses on gardening, as well as horticulture, fruit tree care, and other things like that. So he knows what he's talking about. All right, I hope you enjoy it. Good things are happening here at the garden.
It's a pleasure to be here. This class is meant to be an intro to the basics of organic vegetable gardening, as well as how those basics apply to vegetable gardening in Central Texas. So there's some general horticultural rules that we'll touch on, and then some more specific rules of what and when we plant in Central Texas. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then I'll open it up to Q&A for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we're going to take a walk around and look at a plot, and then we're actually going to go over to the community plot and plant some vegetables and seeds, so y'all can get an idea for the depth of seed sowing, as well as what to do with vegetable transplants. So I'm going to talk about sunlight, soil, and how to maintain it and improve it, and what that entails, as well as water and irrigation, how often, how much, and then touch on inputs. So fertilizers, pesticides, because we still do use pesticides in organic gardening. They're going to be certified organic or homemade. Basically, they're going to be derivatives of stuff you would find in nature, but we still use them to abate pest damage and combat plagues and funguses. All right, so let's start off with sunlight. Almost all of the vegetables and herbs that we're going to grow, especially fruit-producing vegetables like tomatoes, peppers, squash, cucumbers, eggplant, they're going to need at a minimum, and this is the minimum, 6 hours of direct sunlight. Ideally, especially those fruit-producing plants would get 10 plus hours, perhaps even sun all day. And that's because plants photosynthesize, they produce energy, carbohydrates, and so the more sunlight, the more they're able to photosynthesize. And that's really important for all of our edible plants, because we're going to be taking away biomass whenever we harvest. So all of the energy that they allocate for their leaves, we're going to, and as well as the nutrients and water that they distribute, we're going to be taking away whenever we harvest that piece of the plant, whether it be a leaf or a fruit. So we need to set them up in a position where they receive the most sunlight possible. And when I say direct sunlight, I mean sunlight as if you look behind you, or even like in this gap or further on to the other side of the garden, the space isn't sitting underneath any trees. It's completely open. There's no large structures that is providing shade during a particular time of day. And so it's receiving sunlight, especially like behind us, from the morning on into the afternoon. In a perfect world, in the summertime, your plants would get maybe a little bit of that late afternoon shade when the sun is really intense, but that's a perfect world, and I wouldn't substitute full sun for that, for a partial shade situation. And that full sunlight is especially important for, like I said, the fruit-producing plants, your vegetables, cucumbers, tomatoes, peppers, and it's important that your garden be on the south side of a tree line or a large structure, because in the wintertime, the sun gets lower in the sky. So anything on the north side of a large structure, directly adjacent, will likely be shaded. And keep in mind that after we pass the summer solstice, the days get shorter. So I believe we've already passed our last 10-hour day. I believe that was October 10th. And so we need to keep that in mind for when we're sowing and planting, because in order to produce the vigorous young growth, we want to get our plants in time in the fall in order to appreciate that amount of sunlight. Obviously, when we go to the spring, the days are going to get longer and longer and longer, so there's not as much as an issue then. But in the fall, we have to keep in mind that we're losing daylight hours until the winter solstice. All right, let's talk about soil. I remember gardening here that there is, well, if you're lucky that you've got the benefit of someone having already amended or brought in a good gardening soil, and then you got about 6 inches of that, and then you've got sand, or it's cinder, isn't it? It was an old brick factory, I think, here.
All of them are in the new phase, though. So.
Oh, okay, so they don't have that.
Yeah, no.
No, all we have is sand and rocks.
Oh,
That's
better. Okay, good.
We do.
Okay, so in the old phase, a lot of us had the benefit of having that already worked in and amended additional soil, but then underneath you got sand and rocks. That has to be amended. Sand is great for drainage, which is important, and we'll touch on that a little bit later, but it's really bad at holding nutrients, and it doesn't have very much to almost maybe no, depending on how much sand it is, organic matter. And so the sand and rocks is not, it has plenty of pore space for roots to grow, but it holds very little nutrients and water. And so in this particular situation, you've got two options. You can amend the existing soil like you see everyone else has around, or you can build raised beds, as some people also have. And those are two different styles. It depends on how you want to go about it. Amending the existing soil and not raising the garden up, building a structure like you see some folks have, stacked on cinder blocks and stuff like that. That's gonna allow you probably a quicker turnover. You're going to be able to bring in a large volume of well amended garden soil and provide your plants, nutritious space to grow overnight, because you're just going to build it up and bring in your ready to garden soil. Amending it's going to take more time. You're going to have to, for several seasons, add large quantities of compost, maybe 2 to 4 inches spread out over the soil, and either work that in every season or annually. And you're doing that to increase the organic matter as well as the water holding capacity and the nutrients in the soil. It's definitely doable. A lot of folks have done it on the other side, haven't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Started out in the same position.
Yeah.
They all have crappy soil.
Yeah. So just keep in mind that if there's two ways to go about it, but you have to do one or the other, because your garden plants aren't gonna, Bermuda grass is about the only thing that's gonna absolutely love to grow in that rocky sand. But we want our plants to be as happy and healthy as possible. So there's several ways to go about it, and the two most popular are going to be amending the existing soil or building raised beds. And they both work great. But either way, the point to take home is that you're going to have to be amending your soil on more than an annual basis. You might even do it every time you take a crop out. You might add a little bit of compost, add fertilizer. And so for all of the nutrients that you're taking out, for all the organic matter that's been consumed by the microorganisms in the soil, you have to add more of it in order to sustain the health of the soil. And that's no matter how you go about practicing gardening. And the compost is great for, that you're going to add, is great for organic matter, and it also feeds the soil life. And so in our soil we have a microbial population, and they're the ones doing a lot of the work to make the nutrients available to the plants. And so we want to do two things for the microbial population. We want to feed them with organic matter, compost, which if you have any questions about compost, Brian's your man. And that's really important for gardening, is adding that compost. So we want to feed them, but we also want to disturb them as little as possible. And so at this point, because I've worked my garden for so long, I practice no-till in my garden. So what I do is I add a couple inches of compost a year as a mulch, a layer of mulch, and then I plant directly in that, because I don't want to till at all. I don't want to disturb the microorganisms at all by turning the soil over. Some of y'all may not have that option because you do have to remove weeds, and you have to improve your soil, and so that may not be an option for you until a few seasons down the line. But keep in mind that our soil is alive, and we want to keep our population healthy. All right, let's move on to water. It's really important to give plants, especially edible plants, water when they need it and how much water they need. And we want to avoid overwatering as much as we want to avoid underwatering, because we can damage plants, slow their growth, cause fungus to grow just as easily by overwatering as we can cause plants to wilt and die by underwatering. So there's a pretty simple method that you can use to gauge whether or not you need to water for the period of time that it takes you to become familiar with your soil and your garden and how much plants need water. And that's by reaching your hand or your fingers into the soil about up to your first knuckle, and then grabbing a ball of it. And you want it to form a ball, and you want it to be moist, kind of like a wrung out sponge. You don't want it to be dry and crumbly. If it's dry and crumbly, that tells you need to water. If it's soaking wet and you're squeezing, when you squeeze it, drops fall out of it, that'll tell you that either you're watering too much or your soil probably doesn't need to be watered for a few more days. But we want to keep that soil moisture, we want to keep an even soil moisture, kind of like a wrung out sponge. And this can be a little tricky. This just takes time spent in our garden. And there's two things to keep in mind. Younger plants are going to need less but more frequent irrigation, so shallower irrigation, especially germinating seeds. You might, for example, in weather like this, it's hot, it's sunny, it's windy, you might be watering your newly sown seeds once or twice a day, every day. Whereas established plants prefer deeper, less frequent irrigation. So, for example, that chard plant looks pretty old. It probably was carried over through the summer, or maybe was planted really early in the fall. But that type of plant in a well-amended garden soil will probably only need to be watered a couple times a week, but really thoroughly. Whereas some of these plots, you know, that you see bare soil on, that surface is going to need to be moist. Even like if I transplanted these young transplants before they begin to grow for the first week or so, they're going to need water maybe every day, maybe every other day, but it depends on your water holding capacity in the soil. Yeah.
If our soil is super sandy, does that require more water?
Absolutely,
Okay.
yeah. So sand drains really well, and it doesn't hold very many nutrients. So all of y'all who have sandy, rocky plots, which sounds like is everyone, y'all are going to be watering a lot. You're also going to be putting a lot of organic matter and nutrients like, you know, organic fertilizers, amending your garden. And that's your key to success, is amending the soil and keeping the soil moisture level adequate for plant growth. And so you've got, so the take home is that different plants at different stages of their growth are going to require different amounts of water at different frequencies. But it's really important, especially for young plants and seeds that are germinating, that you don't let the upper inch or so dry out, especially when it's hot and sunny like this. Obviously, cloudy days, humid days, cooler days, the soil is going to dry out slower. And as we head into the winter, you might have to water less and less frequently. I might even get some rain, who knows? But as we head into the summer, you might be watering even your established plants 2 or 3 times a week in like a really, when I say deep and thorough irrigation, you want that water to be able to penetrate, you know, 6 to 12 inches down in the soil. And you only understand how much thorough is for your garden space by digging down in the soil. You know, say for example, after you irrigate, digging down the soil a few hours later and seeing how far the water has penetrated. Then you can make a mental note, okay, I spent a half hour watering my plot, and with that volume of water that was let out of the hose, it penetrated down 6 inches. And so you'll start to get a feel for the length of time that you need to water your plot. All right, let's move on to inputs. And so we've talked about a few of them: compost and fertilizer. Compost is fantastic. Like I said, it adds organic matter, which is going to feed the soil, as well as nutrients. It's great for soil structure and just all around soil health. Y'all still have the big piles, right? Yeah. Okay, great. So you can get it here. You can purchase it. You can get it in bags. You can get it in bulk, and it's something that you'll add frequently, or throughout the garden life, and so you'll probably do that several times a year. One important thing about compost is you want to make sure it's thoroughly broken down. I mean, you don't want really large chunks of organic material going into your soil. So before you add the compost, I would recommend screening it, then adding whatever you screened out back into the compost so it can continue breaking down. So like I said, compost is great. Let's see.
Seems we have a question.
Yeah. Question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we were actually advised to have a raised bed, and we put mostly compost in there.
Okay.
Like 90% compost, maybe 10%, whatever sand was around. Is that a mistake?
I've never heard of that mixture, but I'll say this: there's a lot of interesting garden techniques. I would put up to 90% compost. I wouldn't put up to 90% compost.
And what would you recommend?
I would recommend either an already mixed raised bed product, or 2/3 soil and then 1/3 compost. Yeah.
What happens if we just have sand and not soil?
That is soil. It's a soil particle, and so soil is just essentially, you could think of it as substrate. It's what plant roots are going to grow in, And so sand is the largest soil particle, and like I said, it drains really easily and it doesn't hold nutrients well. So you're going to be amending it with loads of organic matter. If you had clay, which holds water well, holds nutrients, and has a lot of organic matter, you would want to improve the porosity of it. But you've got the opposite problem. You've got very little organic matter and a very well draining soil. So I would recommend, just like on a general rule, that first thing you do if you want to garden in the ground and not do raised beds, that you add a few inches of compost and incorporate that into the soil for the first couple seasons, and then reassess if you can start transitioning to a no-till practice where you just top dress with compost. I did. I was looking for a granular fertilizer, but this will do. All right, so we have organic, granular, and liquid fertilizers. This is a liquid fertilizer. It's hydrolyzed fish emulsion, and we're going to make a dilution out of this. And this is great for immediate, or somewhat immediate, as organic can get, results for plant growth. So this would be applied to the plants. This can also be applied with a foliar spray, and the plants take in the nutrients through their leaves. And this is something that we can use for, in addition to the nutrients that we're going to add into the soil with compost and granular fertilizer. Notice that at the bottom here, there's 3 numbers. And these numbers say 2, 4, 1. That's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Plants need a lot more than those 3 nutrients, but nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium are considered macronutrients, and every fertilizer bag or bottle you get is going to have these 3 numbers on them, as well as the granular fertilizers you're going to use. When we purchase fertilizers, whether it be at an independent nursery or a big box store, we want to get products that are organic. And so they're going to say organic on them like this, or for organic gardening. Sometimes they'll often have the certification board. So this is OMRI, Organic Materials Review Institute, and they certify products for organic farming and gardening. And so when we buy our fertilizers, we want to get those products that are natural derivatives. Some products that we use aren't going to be certified, but are commonly accepted as organic products. One of those is liquid seaweed. Don't know why it's not certified. Don't blame the company. It's a headache to do all the paperwork. But sometimes fish emulsion and liquid seaweed don't have anything that suggests it being organic, but it certainly is. When you look at the product, for example, this is just, I believe this is just seaweed that's been emulsified, and same with the fish. And so I believe the companies just don't want to go through the certification process. But these are, seaweed and fish are 2 of the most common and 2 of the best liquid components that we can add in. And there's a whole host of granular fertilizers that we can use. Most of them are derivatives of animal products. So bone meal, blood meal, feather meal, those are all composted products from animal production facilities, and they all work great. They all break down relatively quickly and become available for plants in the soil. It's important to add those fertilizers a few weeks before you sow, and then add them throughout, maybe depending on the type of fertilizer, add them continuously throughout the season, maybe 2 or 3 more times, because the plants are going to use the nutrients, and it's going to take a little while. We add them a little bit before we sow because it's going to take a little while for those microorganisms to mineralize the nutrients and make them available for the plants. If you don't want to use animal byproducts, there are some products that don't come from animals, like cottonseed meal, alfalfa meal, or pellets. Cottonseed meal is great, and it's one of my favorites. I really like cottonseed meal and bone meal, but like I said, there are a whole host of them, and this is something that we're going to add several times a year, and it's well, I'll keep this brief, but we're learning how much and what type and when plants use nutrients. We're learning new information all the time in plant physiology. But the long and the short of it is that you have to feed your plants. They're going to have to get nutrients somewhere. Some people swear on just using compost. Some people don't use compost and they just use fertilizer. I like to use both. I like to think of compost as being the kale smoothie, and then fertilizer being the meat and potatoes. And so, having that perfect balance of nutrients and organic matter in the soil. But one way or another, you're going to need to feed your plants. In addition to what we put in the soil, there's also going to be things that we use to either keep pests like insects from eating our plants, or keep fungal growth off of our plants. And there are plenty of organic products that are really effective that we can apply, and you should consider using, especially when you first begin to notice a problem. And I'll just touch on those just to familiarize yourselves that in organic gardening, we do use pesticides. We still have pests, and we still spray things on the plants to kill them. The difference is that we're using pesticides that break down really quickly in the environment. And it doesn't mean that the pesticides aren't harmful to what we are trying to kill. And even in some situations, the pesticides are harmful for us. So we should use caution and proper PPE whenever we're applying them, especially some of the more deadly organic pesticides. Two of the most common are BT and insecticidal soap. These will kill a lot of the pests that are gonna plague you. Two of the most common this time of year are caterpillars, especially cabbage loopers. You see them all over the brassicas. And BT is a bacteria that kills caterpillars, all caterpillars. It's applied to the leaf. The caterpillar eats the leaf and with the BT on it, and shortly after it dies. It's very effective. Kills all caterpillars though, even monarch larvae and swallowtail larvae. So just keep that in mind. It's very effective. I use it every year. Unfortunately, this time of year the cabbage loopers are out. And the other is insecticidal soap. This smothers the exoskeleton of soft-bodied insects and reduces or eliminates their ability of respiration, to breathe. And this is very effective for insects like aphids, which when it's hot and sunny out, maybe to a lesser extent now, but certainly in the summer, they'll be out, and you'll see them on the underside of the leaf, and they suck the plant, and they form just, sorry? I'm not sure, nodules, but they you'll see usually when there's one, there'll be quite a few of them, and ants like to farm them, if you will, because they eat the honey secretion, the sweet secretion from the aphids. So these are two products that to humans are not toxic, but when I apply these in the nurseries that I work in, it's certified organic nurseries, I still wear a respirator because I don't want to breathe in the aerosol particles. I want to keep those out of my lungs. I also don't want to get insecticidal soap in my eyes. And this is a bacteria. I do have a potential to develop an allergy to this. So just because they're organic doesn't mean there's no harm in them. I see people applying these all the time without any PPE. That's your choice. There's no regulation for PPE when you apply these, but keep in mind there still are some hazards to applying these.
What about eating? So could the beekeeper use those on greens that we would later eat?
Absolutely. The reason that one of the reasons that we're using organic pesticides instead of synthetic pesticides is that they break down very quickly. But this is an example of a product that can be pretty toxic. It's copper fungicide. It's for organic gardening, and it's fantastic. It works very well with funguses, but it's very toxic. You don't want to breathe this in. You don't want to get it on your skin. You don't want to get it in your eyes. And so when I apply this, I wear a respirator, goggles, and I bring a change of clothes because I take off my clothes as soon as I'm done applying it. And they sell this at Home Depot. You can go buy this and spray it willy-nilly without any certification course. But it can be very harmful. But it is an organic pesticide. It's one that is very effective. This is one of my favorites for eliminating slugs and snails that like to, and cutworms that like to cut down our young transplants, especially right after they're transplanted, which is annoying. It's called Sluggo Plus, and it's a pellet that's poured around the garden or the area surrounding the newly transplanted plants, and it's also very effective. And this is something you can find at any independent nursery or big box store too. I think I'll stop there. I think I've said what I've wanted to say about the inputs. We use them in according to the directions, and protect yourself well when you use them.
Yeah. What about fire ants? What do you do?
Well, fire ants, I love this product. It's called Come and Get It. And this works in a similar fashion to a product called Amdro, which is a synthetic pesticide. This is a synthesized bacteria called spinosad. And this causes the mound to collapse. It kills the queen. And so you can use things like, for example, sometimes orange oil is recommended for ants. This is okay, but this just kills the individual ants. This kills the queen, causing the mound to disappear.
So I found one small caterpillar the other day on my cabbage plant, and I just tore the leaf off because I was like, I don't want you to infect everything. So what are the dangers of what happens if I cut a small leaf off my transplant?
Not a big deal, especially this time of year when we've still got like 9 to 10 hour days. It's sunny and warm. That plant's going to reproduce its vegetative growth fairly quickly.
Okay.
You made the right decision there. Eliminating the pests, that's part of like an integrated pest management practice, is eliminating the pests when you see them in very small numbers and as soon as you can. removing plant matter does open up a vector because it's a cut in the plant, but it'll heal itself very quickly. I would remove that insect. That's more important than trying to keep the plant from having all its leaves from when it planted. Yeah, that was the right call. And typically, that's when you want to, whatever you choose to do is in terms of pest management, that initial sighting, the old saying is the best pesticide is a gardener's shadow because you're out in the garden. That initial sighting is when you want to exercise your pest management practice.
Do you recommend mulching the things that we're growing?
Yes and no. It's always good to have the soil covered. That keeps the soil temperature cool or warmer in the wintertime. In the summertime, it keeps the sun off of it, and it decreases evaporation. It keeps the soil microorganisms happier. You don't want to mulch too much because you still want water and air to flow into the root space. So a really thick layer of mulch is gonna remove that ability. More like a couple inches, 2 to 3 inches. Like I said, I mulch with compost now, and I just apply the compost every year in about 2 inches to the top of the soil, and I don't till at all. If you do mulch, don't incorporate the large chunks of mulch into the soil. Whenever you amend the soil, pull the mulch back and then reapply the mulch. When I was here, I mulched with wood chips, and it worked great. Mulching is way better than weeding, and it's effective at abating weed growth as well as maintaining the soil moisture level. So I think it's an important practice if you choose to do so. But in addition to mulching, there's a number of things you can do. You can always have something growing. So you can always be sowing or transplanting your edible plants, or you can practice what's called cover cropping. And that's growing crops that are actually going to feed your soil, and they might even capture nutrients like nitrogen from the air.
For the liquid fertilizer, the fish emulsion, when would you first apply that to transplant?
Great question. I would apply it at transplanting. And there's always a dilution ratio on the back. It's usually like 1 tablespoon, 1 ounce to a gallon, something to that effect. I would apply it at transplanting after I've watered in my transplants. You don't want to apply fish emulsion or liquid seaweed or any other liquid fertilizer when the soil is dry. So I plant my transplants, water them in well, then apply my fish emulsion. And I can use this once a week, every week. This is going to give them an extra boost for growth especially until the pelletized or organic fertilizer that I've put in becomes available. The granular organic fertilizer becomes available to the plants.
And if I were to apply it around this time, is it too hot, or would it burn the plant?
Generally speaking, you want to use these products that are there's going to be residue left on the leaf. You want to apply these early in the morning. This, you could just bypass that altogether by watering around the base of the plant and avoiding leaves. But remember, this has an additional benefit when it's applied to the leaves. So I would apply this early in the morning. And that brings up another point. We want to put our plants to bed. We want the leaves to be dry as we head into the evening. We don't want to put our plants to bed wet. And so we want to try as hard as we can to do our watering ideally in the morning, early afternoon. And I don't follow this rule just because I can't. It's too difficult with work and other things to do that. but I always like to water as best as I can when there's still going to be a few hours of sunlight left, so it'll dry that moisture off the leaves. And that's an important step you can take to removing the possibility of fungal growth.
Any issue watering, like when there's still dew on the plants?
No. You know, you'll probably see that quite a bit in the morning, obviously, but no, there's no issue in that. The dew on the plants and maybe the moisture on the ground doesn't mean that your soil is adequately moist. You still need to dig into your soil and test it. You know, if you've got a couple inches of rain, it's a safe bet that you won't have to water for a few days. But especially in the soil that y'all have, you know, a light rain or a mist doesn't mean that the soil won't dry out the same day.
You might have answered this already, but does that same fertilizer that you just talked about apply for seeds as well, like after you've already put them in the ground? Or?
I would wait to apply the liquid fertilizer to young seedlings or germinating seeds until they develop their first true leaf. So a seed comes out of the ground and they have 2 cotyledons, and then a true leaf, if you will, begins to emerge. And so that's when that begins to emerge, then you can begin to apply your liquid fertilizers. And if you're gonna use a granular organic fertilizer, don't incorporate it directly underneath the area that you're gonna seed. I would do it off to the side as best you can. Any other questions?
Yeah. About soil pH. So the soils here are fairly high and alkaline.
Yeah.
So what do you recommend for lowering that, and how does the pH level affect the nutrient uptake?
Okay, great question, Brian. I've very seldom come across people that were able to drastically lower the soil pH in Central Texas. Our soil sits on top of limestone, so our soil is very alkaline, and guess where we get our water? It's also running through that limestone, so our water is very alkaline. That doesn't mean you can't try. You can use products like sulfur and liquid seaweed plus iron. That's for acid-loving plants. But keep in mind, any pH adjustment that you do is going to be temporary, and it may not have the effect that you want. So we don't add products like lime, for example, to our soil, as you so often see in areas with acidic soil. Lime it every spring or something like that. We would never ever do that because our pH is already high enough. We might add those products, like I said, sulfur, so that we can lower the pH, hopefully, to a level where certain nutrients are available. Because at different levels of pH, different nutrients have different nutrient availabilities. And so when we get alkaline, when we get above 7 and perhaps into 7.2, 7.3, so on and so forth, which a lot of the soils around here are, we might see a decrease in the availability of certain nutrients. And that's when we can add those acidifying inputs to the soil to see if we can free up more nutrient availability. One typical nutrient deficiency we see around here is iron deficiency. And that's not because we don't have it in the soil, but it's because that at a high pH, like 7.5, it's less available to plants.
One last question. Advice. This one will lead into the demo, but advice on Bermuda grass.
Yeah.
And that's my last question.
Great. So this pertains to setting up a new garden and maintaining your garden. When we weed, when we remove any unwanted plant, whatever it may be, we need to take up the vegetative growth as well as the growth below the ground, all the roots, and as much as possible. There's some plants that, like Bermuda grass, nut grass, that have the ability to reproduce from underground rhizomes, for example, like Bermuda grass. And so if we pull up just the leaf, the blade of grass, there's still a huge rhizome underground that they can reproduce from. And so whenever we're weeding, whether it be just standard garden maintenance or a new garden build, we need to take out all the roots. And Brian's got a great method for tackling Bermuda grass.
So I swear, you take the top thing just pops off like nothing, and then you're like,
Yeah, there's a number of tools you can use. This is called a stirrup hoe, scuffle hoe, and it works by shuffling around. This stirrup shuffles back and forth, and it's very effective for getting the soil broken up so that you can get the weeds out of there. And this is really effective for annual weeds, mostly. If you want to kill weeds, this works to disturb weeds like Bermuda grass, but it's not effective at like removing the root. And so with an annual weed, say for example like henbit, it would probably be enough just to scuffle this around the ground, cut the roots from the leaves, and then go on about your business. If you did that to Bermuda grass, you would still have the rhizome in the ground and it would just reproduce as soon as you turn your back on it. My favorite weeding tool is actually, I forget the name, but it's a long hook, and y'all might have one, Brian. Do you?
Yeah, a Korean hoe or something. It looks like a claw,
Yeah.
like an enormous claw.
And what that does is it allows you, like you said, as soon as you pull the leaf, then you've just got the leaf. What that allows you to do is you dig it into the soil, you get underneath the root, and you pull up. And so it allows you to get a large chunk of the root out every time you pull.
What do you think about vinegar for weed control?
I don't like it. Yeah, I think it's okay for annual weeds, but I think it's not effective for perennial weeds. You have to use a very high vinegar solution, and also when I'm just weeding, for example, I don't want to spray vinegar. If it's going to kill the weed, it might also harm my edible plants that are right next to the weed. I would say it'd be just fine for your walking paths or something like that, but I don't want to use that in the soil.
Is it effective? So I mean, we were clearing Bermuda grass and stuff like that. We were just soaking it with vinegar and wondering if that was.
I think that in my experience, vinegar has been effective with annual weeds, but not perennial weeds like Bermuda grass. I mean, there's Bermuda grass is a tough one. That really just takes removing the whole rhizome, then applying a layer so that it can't
We were trying to avoid that heavy duty work.
Yeah.
I guess not.
Bermuda grass requires a spade. It really does. And just take the whole bit of ground out, shake out the dirt, toss it back.
What I did in my garden is I over the years is I've kept it out of my actual plot, and then I've kept the encroaching Bermuda grass out by laying synthetic weed fabric around the border, which has worked really great. Cardboard and mulch is okay, but what happens is that the rhizome actually grows in between those two layers, and so what you're often doing is you're taking the whole cardboard and mulch that's been applied out and redoing it. It's a difficult process, but it's better than nothing. What you don't want is you don't want your garden to become like the field of Bermuda grass that we see behind us, because it's just discouraging. It's when you only got a couple hours on the weekend, it's just discouraging to come to your garden to see that.
Is there anything for birds aside from bird netting?
Yeah, you can use a nylon fabric that will cover the plant. I use these nylon bags this spring that I tied on, and that was effective. I've heard people use pantyhose. I heard people use like fruit shells, you know, like strawberries or blueberries or whatever those come in. Perhaps the most effective method is not letting them get to their peak ripeness. So birds and squirrels are most likely going to go after your tomatoes first. And if you let it get to where it's just like busting at the seams ripe, chances are the birds and the squirrels are going to know that well before you do, because they're out here 24 hours a day. And so what I like to do with, say, peppers or tomatoes is I like to harvest them at about 75% ripe, and then let them finish ripening at home to avoid being eaten by pests. But besides that, there's a number of products that are sold to keep rodents and other pests off your garden. One of that is like you can make at home called pepper spray, and it's effective for squirrels because they have the same capsaicin receptor that we have, and it bothers them. It's not effective for birds because they don't have that receptor. I've used it. I think it's just okay. I think the best method is putting a physical barrier.
When you say 75% ripeness, do you mean just as they're starting to get red? That
No, I
they're
mean,
not fully ripe yet?
if you were to look at it, look at the body of the fruit, if like half to 3/4 of the fruit were ripe and it was softening, that's when you'd pull it. I mean, you can certainly let it get completely ripe if you want and protect it with some sort of covering, but if you let it get completely ripe, you're always risking a chance of it being eaten. And even if you don't, sometimes you'll just come out and a rat or a squirrel's nibbled one bite into your beautiful heirloom Cherokee purple tomato, and it's annoying. You won't have as much rodent problems in the fall with your greens and your root vegetables as you will in the spring with your fruits that you're going to grow. I should have talked about that. All right, who's from Central Texas? All right, so we don't really have a winter here, and so our winter season, if you will, like the time period where there's very little plant activity, is actually late summer, so like July and August. That's when it's hot and it's dry and there's not a lot happening in the natural world, and it's not a lot happening in our gardens either. And we're not out in the gardens either because we're melted. But we actually garden fall through spring. I mean, the winter time is a lovely time to garden. It's cool. You've got these crisp, cool, baby blue sky, January days. It's fantastic. And so we can garden year round. We do get these atypical frosts or these atypical winters. We'll have really low killing frost, maybe even down into the mid-teens. And we certainly do often get hard freezes, like below 28 degrees Fahrenheit here. We'll get several of those in the winter, or at least we should anyway. But we can cover our plants those few nights that it's going to be a killing frost and successfully garden all throughout the winter. What's more is that most of the plants that we're going to grow throughout the fall and the winter are leafy greens like spinach, kale, our brassicas like broccoli, cauliflower, our root vegetables like beets and carrots. Most of those can withstand a light frost, and some of those like kale and spinach can withstand temperatures down into the teens. So if it's just going to be a light frost like 32 degrees Fahrenheit, we might not have to cover it all. But what's important to keep in mind is it's the length of time that it's going to stay below freezing and the severity of the frost as well. That will indicate whether or not we need to go out and cover. But yeah, real quick, I wanted to touch on that is that fall, winter, early spring, we're growing our what we call cool season crops. So all your green vegetables, your cool season herbs like cilantro, parsley, and your root vegetables, turnips, beets, radishes, carrots. And then we transition springtime. I think our last average frost is March 4th. And so by the middle of March, we're planting our fruit producing vegetables like tomatoes and peppers, and we're growing those from transplants. That's very important. Peppers, tomatoes, eggplants are grown from transplants here because it gets very hot in the summer and the ability to produce good quality fruit decreases as it gets hotter and drier. And then we're also planting squash, cucumbers, melons, okra. We're growing that. We're planting those as it gets on into April. So those are growing all summer, and then our garden burns up and we don't want to go outside anymore. We just want to go swimming in August, and we just maybe do the bare minimum to keep our plants alive in August. And then we come back in September and we start sowing for the fall all over again until, into October as well. So there's a ton of publications out there and blogs and stuff like that that will indicate April is the time that you plant kale. You can certainly grow kale throughout the year, but April is not the time to plant kale here in Central Texas. When you get gardening information, you want to be very particular about if it's general garden information, that's okay. But if it's planting times and varieties to plant, you want to get that specific to Central Texas. And the A&M Research Facility has a Central Texas planting calendar. That's a good one to follow. Any other questions? All right, let's go take a look at a bed over there, and then we're gonna go plant in the community garden. Okay, we're here in this sand pit, and as you can see, this is very sandy soil. And so if you have soil like this, or like in that plot behind you, where it's sandy and rocky, you're gonna need to amend it with copious amounts of organic matter, i.e. compost. The first thing you're gonna have to do though, is you're gonna have to remove all these weeds. And we have some different types. A weed is essentially any plant you don't want growing in its spot. So we've got some annual weeds like the amaranth, and we've got some perennial weeds like this vine right here. I don't see any, I see maybe a little bit of Bermuda grass, but the perennial weeds are a little bit tougher. Here's some Bermuda grass up at the front. And these perennial weeds are a little bit tougher to get out and keep out than the annual weeds. The annual weeds, like these amaranth, you can often pull out, and if you grab the root, you've done a good job. If I just do this, well, or say for example, I just pull it out and I've just got the top of the vegetative growth, that's not good enough. That's gonna regenerate. So one thing you can do to encourage the root to come out is you can moisten the soil before you weed. You don't want it soaking wet, but if you moisten it, the roots will come out a little bit easier. The nice thing about these annual weeds too is I can come in here with like this stirrup hoe and rake it up, easy peasy, and then I can just come in and take all these, if there's any roots that I want to take out, I can rake those out afterwards. This is not as effective with Bermuda grass. And so if I come in here, I'll do it up here actually. If I come in here and I'm using the stirrup hoe on this Bermuda grass, well sure, I can see bare spots of soil, but all of the rhizomes are still right on top of the soil. The next time it rains, they're gonna make contact with the soil and they're gonna regenerate. Furthermore, whatever's beneath the ground, I can't see anymore. So what I probably have to do is I probably have to come in here with a shovel or a fork, and I have to dig down, and I actually have to see if I can get to the roots and remove these. Let's see if I can find one. Okay, so these spread through a rhizome. And so at the nodules, the plants touch the ground and then they grow roots down. And then also underground, they'll have underground rhizomes, the Bermuda grass will. You can see right there where the plants spread along the ground and where it touched on the ground, it sent roots down. That's why with Bermuda grass, we want to remove the whole thing out of our garden. It's not enough to just come through with a stirrup hoe and cut it at the ground level. We got to take the whole plant out of the garden. And we definitely need, Brian's got a great method where he gets in the soil and he takes a big shovelful and he'll dump that shovel into a screen, and the soil pass through and all the roots and whatnot will stay on the screen. And if you're starting to garden from scratch, that might be what you have to do. Otherwise, you're just going to constantly be fighting an uphill battle. If you take the time and get all the roots out of it, before you plant, you'll be off to a good start. And then after that, you'll just need, some maintenance several times a year. But it's best to stay on top of the weeds and not let them get out of control.
So when I dug mine out, I got all mine removed, I think. I also would have chopped some of the roots, actually I was trying to get everything out I could.
Yeah.
Are those they're just gonna end up sprouting?
Probably. It's inevitable that the first few times you do your first really thorough big weedings, it's inevitable that you're going to have some come back. It's not going to be perfect. I think weeding is a good thing to do several times a month, or maybe even once a week when you're out in the garden. Just after you water and you see some weeds, pull a few before it gets out of hand. Because if it gets out of hand, then you're less likely to take on that daunting practice.
So mine have this interesting, fun vine.
Yeah.
I've already planted. I've pulled some of these out, and they've been a yard long.
Yeah, those have a big
I'm
root.
concerned if I actually go after the root, I'm going to interrupt and disrupt what I'm actually trying to plant. So
Yeah.
how do I?
Yeah.
Do I just go down as far as I can? Or?
I would take as much root out as you can and stay on top of it. Just like with the Bermuda grass, the weeds are going to be, the perennial weeds especially, are something that we're going to have to stay on top of because you're never going to get all the root. And some of the perennials have really long roots, or they have spreading rhizomes underground. So yeah, for example, this is the vine you have, and this vine may very well be to extend to where you're standing. So we want to get as much of the root as we can and stay on top of it. And unfortunately, there's no other way around that. When we inherit a plot that's really weedy, what we have to do is just stay on top of the weeds in order to get to the point where what we're doing is just maintenance weeding. We're not having to come back every season and weed a completely covered plot. Yeah, I know it's not a satisfying answer, but we all deal with it. I still deal with Bermuda grass in my garden. It's just the reality. It's if you sprayed something, you might be affecting your vegetable plants as well. So these are the best weeders we got. That and the hook I was telling you about. That might be effective with that long root. Any other questions?
Where is that hook stored in the shed?
Well, I have my personal one.
Oh.
They cost $15, $18 like at home down southwest. The Natural Gardener, you can order them online.
Another important thing about weeding is we want to get the weeds before they go to seed. So like this amaranth has gone to seed and there's hundreds and hundreds of seeds in there. That'll just be hundreds and hundreds of more plants that are going to reproduce next spring. And so that's why staying on top of it helps a lot. Even if we just pull the leaves out, that's all that energy and biomass that we've taken from the plant. So that's better than nothing. All right, so we want to make sure that before we plant, the surface of the soil is flat and even. An even soil surface is going to help with the distribution of water. If we've got gullies or If it's slanting one way or another, like on an incline, we might have a problem with the distribution of water. You'll see some people build mounds, and that's okay. I like a large bed rather than a bunch of individual mounds, because plant roots extend much further than their canopies or their drip line. And so something in a bed like this, for example, I would keep it flat. I wouldn't mound it up. If I had a big open space, I might build several, or maybe one long three foot or 4 foot wide bed, raised bed, if you will, and that would suffice for drainage. That'd be adequate for drainage. Anyway, so I've got it clean, and I'm gonna smooth out the surface. And we've got a variety of our cool season vegetables here. Some brassicas, kale collards, Napa cabbage, cauliflower. We've got a perennial vegetable, artichoke, and some lettuce. These are all plants you can sow right now, and they'll grow throughout the fall and winter. So several of these plants, like I said, are better. Some plants are better from transplant, and that's going to be your fruit and head producing plants. So in the springtime, your vegetables like tomatoes and peppers are better because it takes such a long time to get those to produce. Squash and cucumbers are okay from seed. You can also do those from transplants. And in the fall and the winter, plants like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, those are better from transplant, because they need to have a large biomass above ground in order to produce what you're going to harvest, that head. And so we've got fading sunlight, so we want to give those the best head start that we can. And you can find these at independent nurseries as well as the big box stores. And so I'm going to plant this kale. This also, planting from these 4-inchers also allows you to get a head start on the season, and there can be a higher success rate, because I'm going to have to water this plant less frequently than I would have to water the seeds we're going to plant. So I take the pot, turn it upside down, put it in my 2 fingers in between the plants so it doesn't fall out, and I squeeze it out. And that's what I want to see when I pull a transplant out. You've got the roots have filled out, but it hasn't become, you don't have too many circling roots or girdling roots at the bottom. It's not pot bound. It's just at the best time to be transplanting it. So I want to tease some of the roots just a little bit to encourage them to spread out and not continue that pattern. This is much more important with perennials like shrubs and trees. That's a whole different ballgame. That you want to be very rough with the roots, actually. But the annuals, we don't have to be as rough. And so I tease the roots a little bit, pull the soil back, and what I want to do is with almost all annual vegetables and herbs, they're modest. They want their shoulders covered. So I just want to cover the existing soil that it came out of with the garden soil. So not too shallow. Some plants are more forgiving than others if you plant them too deep, but essentially just cover the soil line in the pot. And then after I would plant this, I could continue on with the spacing, depending on what species and what varieties I was planting. But that's something to be mindful of. So this kale plant, I'm going to be picking leaves off of it throughout the season, but it's probably going to take up a space of about like that, if you can imagine. A broccoli plant would probably take up this entire space. It's going to get enormous. And this artichoke plant would take up this whole square. All right, so I've got my transplant, and Now I'm going to plant some seeds. I'm going to grow some spinach. Seeds can be difficult. If you're new to gardening, you're going to have more success probably with the larger seeds than you are with smaller seeds like carrots and lettuce. You know, those seeds are teeny tiny. Just if I were holding them in my hand, you'd have some blown away. These larger seeds are going to give you a little bit better success rate. So you can see pretty forgiving seed size. There's a whole bunch of instructions on the back for seed depth and spacing and stuff like that. Some of the spacing is flexible depending on what you're gonna do. Is in terms of if I want these to get, you know, big mature spinach plants, I want to have adequate spacing. If I'm gonna come in and keep cutting the leaves off and it doesn't matter if they stay small, I don't have to have as adequate spacing. Spacing is really important with root vegetables because if you can imagine, if you want a big honking carrot or beet, you need to give it that much space. And so if you might be seeding a carrot, you know, one every inch, and it might be like, oh my God, what if these don't germinate? Well, you can do that, or you can plant a lot and come back and thin, but one way or another, you know, within the first few weeks of that carrot development, you need to have the roots spaced out adequately. Seed depth is really important. Each seed has a certain depth that it will requires to germinate. I don't pay much attention to exact depth anymore. I try to sow, with a few exceptions, I try to sow a little bit on the shallow side and keep the soil moist. And I like to get all of my seeds in the ground at about 1/4 inch. And so for me, that's up to the end of my fingernail. Bigger seeds like squash, you'd want to do those at about 1/2 inch, or maybe okra. These larger seeds too, like spinach, I'm going to probably do these at 1/4 to 1/2 inch. And some of that, obviously, if I do a row like that, well, I can't really tell. I mean, that's about 1/4 inch, it's about 1/2 inch. That's a range. I'm looking for a range, not an exact depth. So I come in here and I want to harvest this spinach for sort of cut and come again. I want to continue to harvest the leaves off of it. So I'm going to plant a spinach seed every inch. And so I've got my spinach sown. Come back, cover it up, and ideally you would mark it so you know where you sowed your seeds. So we're just going to pretend like that's a spinach marker, and after I cover it, I'm going to pat it down to get good seed to soil contact, and then I'm going to come through and I'm going to water. And so with seeds, I don't want the I don't want to cause a river in the soil because I don't want my seeds to run away. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to keep making passes like this, back and forth. Now I'd actually wait for a second and let that settle, and then come back again, make a few more passes back and forth. And so the idea is that I'm getting decent saturation, but I'm not creating a situation where the seeds are going to be carried off by the water. With this transplant, since I just transplanted it, I want to water the area around the transplant as well as the base of the transplant, because I want that soil, water moves to where water isn't. So the soil surrounding the plant is going to pull the water from the area around the transplant. And I want to encourage the roots to venture out and travel much further than the base of the plant. And so when I water the established plants, I always water a decent amount outside of the canopy zone. And so, for example, if it were dry, sunny, windy, and warm like it is today for the next few days, I would water those seeds at least once a day, every day. And I would water this transplant depending on how well draining my soil is. I might also water it once a day, but at least once every other day. Once the plant grows up and becomes big like these kale plants behind us, they're probably going to only require water a couple times a week.
And does it matter if you get water on the leaves with transplants?
That's a great question. Because we garden in a drier climate, it's not quite desert, but it isn't East Texas either. We actually have the benefit of not having as much fungal growth. We usually have the bulk of our fungal pests in the early spring where we're getting a lot of rain. It's really humid, really cloudy. And so one thing we can do to encourage or rather discourage fungal growth is we can keep the leaves of our plants dry. This is still a community plot, right, Brian? Yeah. Okay, so if I were to water this, I would want to avoid doing that, because every time I water the leaves, it's encouraging the habitat for fungus to grow. It's kind of unavoidable, obviously, with smaller plants and germinating seeds. It's unavoidable to water the leaves unless you use a soaker hose, which I don't think those are allowed, are they? Soaker hoses? Okay. Soaker hoses are fantastic because they put water directly into the ground. But in absence of those, what you can do, especially when plants are established, like this bed, for example, I'm just going to come in and I'm going to water around the plant. See how I'm saturating the soil around the plant? But I'm keeping the leaves relatively dry. And you see how much I'm watering and how much I'm moving around? Because the water's collecting, it's pooling up, but I want it to get deep down into the soil and I want it to adequately cover the entire bed. So avoiding watering the leaves is ideal. Sometimes it's impossible. It's especially important in seasons like the springtime, early summer, when we have some of our biggest fungal problems. It's important to avoid watering the leaves. And especially if you can. That's why watering in the morning is good, because it has the whole day for the leaves to dry out. Any other questions? I love your mask, by the way. Does anyone want these plants? You've got Napa cabbage, couple broccoli, couple collards, cauliflower, artichoke, lettuce, and a kale. All right, I'll set them back over where we had the class, or it looks like.
Yeah, put them over by the.
Oh, y'all got a whole bunch of plants. Okay, cool.
We had 400 last week.
That's great.
It's all broccoli, but yeah.
All right. Well, this is actually no broccoli. Well, it's 2 broccoli. So, if anyone's lacking plants, yeah,
All right.
have at it. You're welcome. My pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Rob.
You're welcome.